The morning sun filtered through the blinds, streaking golden across the tiled classroom floor. Mr. Allen adjusted his tie as he scrawled, "Debate etiquette," across the whiteboard in bold letters. He was a seasoned history teacher, known for his no-nonsense attitude and sharp tongue. Today, however, he felt the tension rise as students began trickling in, chatting about last night's basketball game and the latest trends from TikTok. In came Brian, his bright red "Make America Great Again" hat proudly perched on his head. The room instantly stopped breathing, literally, and all eyes revolved toward this 16-year-old junior class. Brian was, by no account of the imagination, a kid who would shrink into non-being from any modicum of attention thrown in his direction. Yet even for him, the charged ambiance of that evening made him raise an eyebrow as he adjusted the backpack strap and occupied his usual chair somewhere in the middle rows. Mr. Allen spun around, marker in hand, his eyes fixing on the flash of red on Brian's head, his eyelids lowering. His lips thinned, and he began to tap the marker against his palm, movement that generally preceded one of his truly acid remarks. "Brian," he said, his voice whipping in, "what is the meaning of this? Now we're making political statements in my classroom?" Brian didn't bat an eyelid. "It's just a hat, Mr. Allen," he said coolly. "The school rules say nothing about what I can and can't wear." The class fell silent. A few kids shifted uncomfortably and turned to the other. Mr. Allen moved closer toward Brian. His polished shoes clicked the floor, and almost menacingly in the dead silent classroom. "That hat," he said, "symbolizes division, symbolizes intolerance. You're disrupting the learning environment." Brian's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not disrupting anything. I'm just sitting here, ready to learn." Mr. Allen's face flushed a deeper shade of red, and his voice rose. "Ready to learn? Wearing something that insults half the people in this country?" He gestured toward the door. "Take it off or leave my classroom." Brian hesitated, glancing around the room. Some students were whispering behind their hands, others looking away awkwardly. He stood his ground. "I'm not breaking any rules," he said firmly. "I'm staying." The tension was palpable. Mr. Allen threw up his hands. "Fine. If you want to be a distraction, so be it." He turned back to the board, muttering something under his breath. The lesson continued, but the atmosphere remained thick, every eye occasionally darting to Brian and his defiant red hat. When the students filed out after class, Mr. Allen called Brian to his desk. "You're a smart kid," he began, softer but yet firm. "But that hat, it's not just some simple piece of clothing. It carries weight. You are young. You might not understand that yet." Brian met his eyes, expression calm but definite. "I understand more than you think, sir. And I think everybody deserves to say whatever they want to say, however they feel it, whatever side they are on." Mr. Allen blew a heavy sigh and waved at him. "Just think about it, Brian. That's all I ask." Brian nodded but said nothing more. As he left the room, his MAGA hat still clutched firmly on his head. But that wasn't all. By lunchtime, word of what had gone on in history class had spread like wildfire through the school. Some kids admired Brian's guts and rallied around him. Others avoided him, not wanting to be tarred by the same controversial brush. He went into the staff room and declared to his colleagues, "Can you believe that? Some students wear that hat in my class. It's like slapping everything we teach about respect and inclusion in the face." Ms. Carter, the English teacher, merely raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it also about teaching freedom of expression?" Mr. Allen snorted. "Not when it's disruptive." Meanwhile, Brian sat in the cafeteria with his friends, who tried to lighten the mood. "Dude, you're like a freedom fighter now," joked his best friend Jason. "You should start a movement." Brian chuckled, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew the hat wasn't just about politics. It was about standing up for what he believed in, even if it made him a target. That night, Brian had related the whole confrontation to his father, Richard Miller, a tall, imposing man with salt and pepper hair, who listened intently. As superintendent of the school district, he had dealt with his share of conflicts. When Brian finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "And how did you handle it?" he asked. Brian shrugged. "I stood my ground. I didn't take the hat off." Richard nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Good, but this isn't over. Teachers have a responsibility to foster understanding, not stifle it. I'll handle it. The next morning, Mr. Allen's day started like any other, until he was summoned to the principal's office. He entered to find Richard Miller seated at the desk, the principal standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Allen," Richard started, his voice measured but firm, "I'm here to discuss an incident involving my son, Brian." Mr. Allen's heart sank. "Your son?" he repeated, realizing too late the connection. Richard nodded. "Yes, my son. The one you publicly humiliated for wearing a hat," Mr. Allen stammered. I didn't mean to humiliate him. I was trying to maintain order in the classroom." Richard's eyes went narrow. "Order? By singling out a student and forcing your political opinions into the discussion? That's not keeping order. That's an abuse of authority." The principal cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we can resolve this." Richard raised his hand. "It's not just about my son. It's creating an environment where every student, whoever they are, can feel safe to express themselves. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about?" Mr. Allen swallowed hard as the blood drained from his face. "I understand. I'll apologize to Brian." Richard leaned forward. "Not only to Brian, but to the class as a whole. And from now on, I expect you to give due consideration to how you handle situations like this. Am I clear?" Mr. Allen nodded, his voice no more than a whisper. "Yes, sir." Later that afternoon, Mr. Allen stood before his history class, a sight of discomfort etched on his face. "Before we start," he said, clearing his throat, "I want to say something. Yesterday, I handled a situation with Brian and his hat in a very bad way. I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment as a teacher, and I'm truly sorry for it." The class was silent. Students looked around at each other in surprise. Brian sat still, his face unreadable. "From now on," Mr. Allen said, "I want this classroom to be a place where everyone feels comfortable expressing themselves, no matter what their beliefs. That's what debate and history are all about." As the lesson went on again, Brian just couldn't stop himself from feeling a tiny sense of pride. He had not only defended himself, he had stood up for something more important. It didn't stop there. The incident sparked a conversation about free speech, respect, and the value of considering perspectives other than one's own that spread throughout the school. Brian's red hat became less of a lightning rod and more of a symbol, not of division, but of standing firm in one's beliefs. One afternoon, an invitation was extended to Brian to speak at a student assembly. Still a little nervous, he stood before hundreds of his peers in the auditorium and began with, "I wore this hat because I believe in freedom of expression. What happened later showed me how valuable listening to everyone can be, including people with opinions that differ from my own." The audience was silent, literally hanging on to every word. "We're all going to encounter people who think differently than we do," Brian continued. "That's not something to fear. It's a chance to learn. We're stronger when we understand each other, even if we don't always agree." The speech ended amidst applause, and the trickling effect of Brian's words started to overflow. Inclusion of cultures started taking hold in school, and it became more open toward other people's point of view. Even resistant, Mr. Allen flowed with the change. He started to run a weekly debate in his class, where he allowed the students to express their points of view concerning others. His father, Richard, watched proudly from the sidelines, knowing his son's small act of defiance had fired up something much bigger. As the months went by, the incident faded with time, but not the aftermath. What would you have done in Brian's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share to spread this story's message of understanding and mutual respect.